The emergence of the Souls-like genre is an interesting study in game design. Developers employ the same fundamental mechanics that FromSoft have made famous over the years and create their own adventure around them. Since this only acts as a basic framework, it's a type of game that allows for a lot of creativity, most notably in world structure and combat. Many studios have tried their hand at this, but it's a delicate genre that requires careful consideration, and too often do they miss the mark. What's more, capitalizing on the Souls-like trend has become increasingly popular over the past decade, to the point where the genre seems oversaturated, making it all the more difficult for titles to stand out. For the rare exceptions that do, though, usually it's for good reason. Lies of P is one of those exceptions. Created by Korean developers NeoWiz and Round 8 Studios, here we have a game that wears its inspirations for all to see. The bleak undertones in its art direction and general aesthetic create a setting that is strikingly reminiscent of Bloodborne, and that's far from the only similarity. But despite this, the game still evokes a feeling of intense peculiarity. There's something oddly alluring about the idea of a Pinocchio-themed Bloodborne-esque adventure. What type of dark and twisted machinations await us with this concept? I want to know, and that desire has brought me here. I've played the game, finished it 3 times, and now I'm making a video on it. It demonstrates just how powerful an idea or concept can be at piquing our curiosity. So, despite being a few months late, I will be giving Lies of P a spotlight. Be warned, this video contains major gameplay spoilers. Welcome to the city of Krat, a once thriving metropolis bustling with commerce and boasting an innovation not seen anywhere else in the world. Robotic automatons known as puppets, powered by the mysterious substance ergo, ushered in a golden age of invention and convenience. They took up various roles in society, such as maids, butlers, teachers, police officers, construction workers, and much more. The people welcomed these mechanical marvels, and it wasn't long before they were ubiquitous throughout the city. But one day, disaster struck. The once subservient puppets suddenly turned violent, brutally killing their human masters in an event known as the Puppet Frenzy. Decimated by the mechanical workforce that once brought prosperity to the city, Krat would fall into ruin shortly after, and remains a shadow of its former glory. I've left out some details, but this is the situation the player character finds himself in, a puppet by the name of P for Pinocchio, seemingly unaffected by the frenzy. It's an intriguing premise, and anyone familiar with the lore of Bloodborne will surely recognize its likeness. The story of Lies of P is all about uncovering the truth behind the puppet frenzy. The game has that typical Souls-like ambiguity to it, but things are far more comprehensible here than other titles in the genre, certainly more so than the games that established the genre, and it pays dividends. This dark reimagining of Pinocchio is fascinating. There's a tremendous sense of mystery from beginning to end, with twists and turns along the way. It had me engaged for its entire runtime. These types of games are notoriously cryptic, and Lies of P has its fair share of obscurity, but there is a clearly defined narrative here, giving purpose to your actions and rewarding you for following through with it. It makes for a refreshing change of pace, and I ended up enjoying it far more than I anticipated. The actual intricacies of the story is not something I will be covering in great detail here, although I will be mentioning a couple things pertinent to the overall experience. For now, I want to make it clear that this game has a story to tell, and makes more effort than most to tell it. At least relative to the genre, anyway. There's a fine line between inspiration and imitation, and Lies of P walks this line deftly. Even ignoring its core setup as a Souls-like, the influence of FromSoft's most famous titles can be seen everywhere in this game. It almost feels like a disservice to say that though, because Lies of P has plenty of originality in its atmosphere, its enemy design, its gorgeously elegant setting, and so on. It is clearly derivative of Bloodborne most of all, and makes no attempts to hide that, but it weaves its own qualities into the formula effortlessly, making for one of the most engaging Souls-likes I have ever played. Lies of P hits all the familiar notes you've come to expect from the genre. Everything from a checkpoint-based progression system to an Estus Flask-type healing system, respawning fodder enemies, etc, it's all here. Classic staples that need no introduction. So with that in mind, we can focus entirely on how it differentiates itself. This game takes bits and pieces from just about every Soulsborne title to create a dynamic, fast-paced combat system that rewards precision and aggression. This is best exemplified through the defensive options you are given, which make up the most vital part of your moveset: guarding, perfect guarding, and dodging. Holding up your guard will block attacks, meaning you take reduced damage that is then transferred into guard regain, this game's take on a rally system, giving you a short window to recover the health you just lost with follow-up attacks. However, if you guard right before being hit by an attack, you can trigger a perfect guard, where you don't receive any damage. This is also one of two ways you can put enemies in the staggerable state, alongside simply attacking them repeatedly. This is clearly indicated by the white outline around the enemy's health bar, meaning they can be staggered with a charged heavy attack, amongst other things, and when that happens, this red icon appears, allowing you to perform a fatal attack, dealing significant damage. Dodging is about as self-explanatory as it sounds, although there are two types in this game. If you're not locked onto an enemy, you will perform a dodge roll, but if you are locked on, you'll perform a quick step. The quick step comes with iframes while the dodge roll does not, and both types are affected by your weight, or equip load. So it combines elements from many titles, right? But what's really clever about Lies of P is the way these systems work together to promote precision and aggression. Being aggressive is beneficial in multiple ways. The more attacks you land, the more health you recover with guard regain, and the more stagger damage you inflict, which, if acted upon, gives you a moment of respite and the chance to deal even more damage. But landing attacks also recharges your main healing item, pulse cells, although this can only be done when they have been discharged, i.e. you've none left and the recharge caps at 1. Still, this is an amazing feature because if you've run out of pulse cells, it's highly likely you are deep into the fight, and so getting an extra one at the death can be incredibly valuable, literally the difference between victory and defeat in some cases. These three mechanics work in tandem with one another wonderfully, as they incentivize calculated aggression. Quick, on-the-spot judgment calls can accrue an advantage for you against the odds. It's great knowing that if you push yourself sometimes just a little bit further, you can turn the tide in your favor. This is then compounded by the perfect guard system. It prevents you from being hit and deals stagger damage to the enemy, so ideally you want to land as many of them as possible. Successfully chaining perfect guards can also break an enemy's weapon, including some bosses. They will still attack you obviously, but they deal far less damage, and depending on the weapon, may have a much smaller range on their attacks as well. So not only is there a very potent risk versus reward dynamic with these systems, but they also synergize with each other. These elements have not just been thrown together aimlessly, they complement one another as a unified whole, giving you a very powerful defensive moveset which doubles as a means of offense. In addition to this, they speed up the pace of encounters as you need to get up close and personal to take full advantage of them, and I tell you, when everything comes together, it is absolutely thrilling. This, to me, is the best thing about Lies of P's combat system, and why I keep returning to this notion of precision and aggression. The potential to claw your way back from the brink of defeat is strong in this game, and I've had some extremely memorable moments because of it. This is just scratching the surface though, let's get into the finer details. Lies of P incentivizes perfect guarding above all else, but dodging, and especially guarding, is an important part of your moveset as well. All three techniques have their place in this game, and in some situations you'll need to prioritize one over the other, or actively switch between them. Trying to perfect guard everything can be detrimental at times. This game is not Sekiro. It hasn't been designed with the same laser-type focus, where virtually everything revolves around deflecting attacks. Instead, it wants you to use all three of your defensive maneuvers, but again, mainly guarding and perfect guarding. For example, when you're up against enemies who dish out a flurry of attacks in a very short period, perfect guarding all of them is possible, but you may get better results by guarding and taking full advantage of guard regain. And that is something else to remember. Guard regain only applies when you are actively guarding. If you receive damage without guarding, you don't get the opportunity to regain that health. I know that sounds exceedingly obvious, but it's something I often forgot. I went into this game with a FromSoft mindset, especially after playing Sekiro again just recently, and I feel that was a mistake. Guarding is just as important as the perfect guard, if not more so, depending on the situation. On that note, the perfect guard can be a little tricky to perform. Not so much because of the guard itself though. I've seen a lot of people compare it unfavorably to Sekiro's deflection system, and I don't see it. You press the guard button just before an enemy attack lands. The feel of it has never been a problem for me. No, the real hurdle comes from the enemies. Outside of bosses and mini-bosses, in this game you fight one of 3 enemy types: puppets, carcasses, and alchemists, but primarily puppets and carcasses. Puppets may have been made to resemble humans, but there's a very distinct, artificial quality to their movements. Obviously this differs from enemy to enemy and attack to attack, but generally they don't swing their weapons in a natural manner, so reading their attacks can be surprisingly tricky. It still catches me out on occasion even now. And the same thing applies to carcasses. They are mutated creatures that move very erratically, wailing their various appendages all over the place, so their attacks are hard to predict. And then towards the end game you'll come up against weird amalgamations of both puppets and carcasses, making it even more difficult to predict their attacks. This is another reason why it is vitally important to use your entire moveset. The game is tailored around both guarding and perfect guarding. I cannot stress that enough. With that said, I really wish you could cancel attack animations and go straight into guarding. I think that alone would alleviate a lot of the frustration with enemies here, but I wonder if that would be too powerful. It's hard to say without testing it properly. As a side note, this idea of puppets and carcasses merging is taken to an amazing level with the Parade Master. It's the very first boss encounter and it's pathetically easy, but then way later in the game you fight the corrupted Parade Master and it's a completely different beast. This also applies to the puppet-devouring green monster, which is essentially a mutated scrapped Watchman. Otherwise, enemies, including bosses, track you with their attacks, especially the Red Fury attacks, which must be perfect guarded, but I never found this to be too much of a problem. Likewise, there are also a whole bunch of delayed attacks, so if you weren't a fan of them in Elden Ring, you probably won't like them here. For what it's worth, I think it's much easier to read them in this game, but that's just me. With 3 distinct types of enemies, 2 of which combine in the late game, as well as a healthy peppering of bosses and mini-bosses, Lies of P has some pretty good enemy variety. Certain mobs are recycled, but otherwise things are kept somewhat fresh for the entire duration of the game. There is also tremendous potential variety in the number of weapons you can use. Lies of P has a unique feature where all weapons are divided into 2 components, the blade and the handle. By using the weapon assembly system, you can then mix and match them in any way you please. Certain blade and handle combinations work better than others, of course, but you are given complete freedom to experiment with them as you wish. However, the game sort of undermines itself in this regard by including boss weapons, special armaments only obtained after defeating bosses, that come with unique skills attached to them. They are easily the most interesting weapons of all, and they cannot be disassembled. I personally did not get any usage out of the assembly system, as the boss weapons were just far more attractive to me. Still, your mileage may vary. I'm sure there are some crazy combinations possible in this game, and it's worth pointing out that not a single boss weapon scales with the advanced stat, which seems like a bit of an oversight, so the weapon assembly system could give you exactly what you're looking for. Despite having slightly different nomenclature, the stats are about as standard as you can get. Motivity in place of strength, technique in place of dexterity, vigor for stamina, etc, etc. The types of weapons on offer are also about as standard as you can get. Daggers, swords, great swords, blunt options, the usual stuff, and each weapon scales better with a specific stat. I messed around with a few different armaments before eventually settling on etiquette, an umbrella that falls under the dagger type, although a rapier would be a more appropriate description. I must say, etiquette is a fantastic name for an umbrella. I love that. I find myself leaning towards dexterity builds these days, so Etiquette's fast-paced, quick-stab sort of playstyle was a good fit for me. It was somewhat repetitive, but the sheer consistency of it more than made up for that. I got a really memorable kill using this weapon. Just look at the way this bear explodes here. It is glorious. It's also one of 2 weapons that can be pushed to S-tier technique scaling, the other being the 2 Dragon Sword, which incidentally is the second weapon I settled on as soon as I got it. It comes with its own unique parry system that perfectly blocks an enemy's attack and immediately launches a charged heavy attack as a counter-strike. It's incredibly satisfying to pull off, especially against bosses. The only downside is there's a bit of wind-up to it, making it much more difficult to land than your perfect guard, but that's a small price to pay for raising the risk versus reward dynamic even further. This is probably my favorite weapon in any Soulslike I have ever played. Lies of P has a lot to offer. There are loads of weapons and potential weapon combinations, some of which come with unique features like the 2 Dragon Sword, all of which come with their own Fable Arts, basically weapon skills, added utility from the Legion Arm, although I didn't get much use out of this admittedly, and around the halfway point you can reset your level at a very low cost, allowing you to redistribute all your stats again, something you can do repeatedly, so you're not limited to any one playstyle. It's great if you find a specific niche in the middle of your playthrough and want to build around it. There is some flexibility here. And this also applies to your unironically named P organ, acting as a skill tree that lets you enhance your abilities and equipment with passive and active upgrades. Major upgrades come in the form of these large nodes, whilst minor upgrades are found in slot abilities, which must be placed into each node for it to activate. It's a simple system, easy to understand, and there are 2 extra phases that only become available once you reach New Game Plus and New Game Plus Plus respectively. Which is cool, I wasn't expecting that. This game makes New Game Plus an enticing prospect in several ways, and this is just one of them. The actual effectiveness of the upgrades varies greatly between them. Any enhancements to pulse cells, the staggerable window, guard regain, amulet slots, and so on, these are all very valuable, but stuff like increased cube uses? I mean, the cube is something I tried out once and never used again. This is a Souls-like, so predictably there are a whole bunch of items gathering dust in my inventory, but what I got most use out of by far were the ampoules, because my god this game loves drowning you in status ailments. Shock and Decay are the most annoying, I'd say. The former completely tanks your stamina recovery, making you close to useless, and I despise the latter because it slowly breaks your weapon over time. The weapon durability system is the one thing I dislike most about this game. It's pretty standard stuff. Every time you use your weapon through attacking or guarding, its durability decreases over time, represented by this bar on the bottom right of your screen. If it gets to the point where the bar is flashing red, that weapon deals far less damage, and if it depletes completely, the weapon breaks, rendering it unusable. Until you reach a Stargazer. It's not like Breath of the Wild or anything like that. You repair your weapon with a grindstone, an item you start the game with, but if the weapon breaks absolutely, you cannot repair it with this method. So repairing your weapon is something you must do constantly, sometimes even in the middle of a boss fight, and this is where I take issue with it. Combat in this game is in a really nice sweet spot with the way your defensive moveset works together, but this durability system diminishes its effectiveness. If your weapon breaks, you're completely screwed, so you need to prioritize it over everything else, which essentially renders guard regain null and void. You cannot risk making use of it if your weapon is about to break. I build my character around one weapon, I cannot equip 2 because it adds too much weight. It's also just incredibly awkward and clunky to repair your weapon in the middle of an encounter with how aggressive bosses are. This is why I hate Decay. It speeds up the process of breaking your weapon, turning some fights into an absolute mess. The animation is satisfying, and there is value in the special grindstones that give you a temporary buff, but this is something I find more cumbersome than anything else. So much so that I opted for the Piercing Hatred amulet over Proof of Humanity, and holy shit, this thing is a game changer. I highly recommend it. Lies of P can be tough, but overall it's nowhere near as challenging as its contemporaries. In fact, I actually think the game is pretty easy. There were occasional moments of frustration, but usually from shit like this. I certainly don't think the game is unfair or anything. The only time I had any sort of trouble was in the fight against Laxasia. Okay, I had some difficulty against Romeo, but only when he performed his Fire Flurry. Once I got past that, the fight was no problem. Every other boss took me like 4, 5, maybe 6 attempts max, and a couple I completed on my first try. I wouldn't describe this as a negative though. I think I just found my groove early on and kept that momentum going till the end. As for the quality of the bosses, most of them are pretty good, I'd say. The only one that really stands out as bad is the Door Guardian, and honestly this fight, while easy, is just not very fun. Having to deal with the shock status is a pain in the ass, and if you die, the run back from the beach is kinda long. I also think the second fight against the Black Rabbit Brotherhood can get very messy, but otherwise it's fine for the most part. For me, the best bosses were the Scrapped Watchman, the King of Puppets, specifically Romeo, and the Nameless Puppet. The Scrapped Watchman is the first real test and it's excellent. Lots of perfect guard opportunities, attacks that are clearly telegraphed, and when you take it down to around 50% health, it will incorporate electric shock into its moveset, which adds an extra element of danger, keeping you on your toes. This is a fantastic introductory boss. The King of Puppets is a two-phase encounter where you first take on this massive machine, followed by its human form, Romeo. This is one of the most exciting fights in the game, because the two forms are on opposite ends of the spectrum. The first phase is a relatively slow, hulking beast, but the second phase is an extremely aggressive, agile fighter, so they each provide their own challenge. I loved going from one to the other, but I especially loved taking on Romeo. It is super satisfying to chain perfect guards against him with how relentless his attacks are. Speaking of which, Lies of P has been criticized for its apparent overuse of two-phase encounters, but in reality only a few of them have a full-on second health bar. I think the bigger problem is that the final 3 fights, assuming you take on the Nameless Puppet, all have double phases, and it drags the game out a bit. The final level is already outrageously long as it is, so adding 3 multi-phase encounters on top of that just exacerbates it in a bad way. The Nameless Puppet is amongst the hardest fights in the game, especially its second phase. This is a hyper-aggressive boss that gives you no time to breathe whatsoever, and that's precisely what makes it so good. This encounter is electrifying, a great way to end the game. If you're having trouble with these bosses, you can choose to summon a Spectre to fight alongside you. Basically an NPC that waddles about, has a health bar, and deals damage to the boss, similar to the Phantom summons from Dark Souls and the like. The effectiveness of the Spectre varies greatly between boss fights. Sometimes they will completely trivialize the encounter, other times they're just not that helpful, and in a couple fights they end up being more of a nuisance than anything else, turning the boss away from you and shit like that, which is annoying if they have a specific weak spot. This is something I only used in New Game Plus, just to test it out more than anything. Personally, I think the game is more than doable without the Spectres, but they're completely optional, so no harm, no foul. Something I will say is that you cannot summon one against the Nameless Puppet, so if you go through the entire adventure using them, this last encounter will likely be a massive difficulty spike. Combat in this game is great. I haven't even mentioned amulets yet, accessories that let you augment your character, very much like the talismans from Elden Ring. Some of these provide really interesting upgrades, and there's a lot of variation between them, resulting in many potential possibilities. Once I found my niche with etiquette and especially the 2 Dragon Sword, I retuned my stats, P-Organ, and amulets to better suit it. This character was now distinctly my character. It was as if everything had fallen into place and my enjoyment of the game skyrocketed. I love the defensive moveset and the risk versus reward dynamic it brings. There's a lot of good things happening with combat here. Of course, there are some minor annoyances as well, but it's faster paced than your typical Soulslike and surprisingly dynamic. I've had tremendous fun with combat in this game, and I'm not even that big a fan of the genre. I see that as testament to its quality. In between combat, you'll spend your time navigating the city of Krat. The game is broken up into 11 chapters, each one representing a new location within the city. As you'd expect, there is a degree of interconnectivity in the world design, making the transition from chapter to chapter completely seamless. It really does flow quite nicely, giving the world a strong sense of cohesion. However, part of the reason for this is because Lies of P is a strictly linear game. Locations are open, there are secrets and hidden rooms to be found, but there's a very clear straight path feel to the adventure that becomes more and more noticeable as you progress, making it virtually impossible to get lost. Now, this is something that leaves me conflicted. In all honesty, I never really found it to be an issue, per se, but I feel it does detract from New Game Plus more than anything else. Lies of P kind of loses a bit of magic on repeat playthroughs, because you know exactly where to go, what to do, what's coming up next, and so on. You may have missed some small details here and there, maybe a character interaction or two, but certainly nothing major. With that said, the game makes up for this through other means, such as extra P-organ phases, discernible boss dialogue, 3 different endings, and more, so it's not like New Game Plus is completely devoid of unique qualities. I just wish it wasn't quite as rigid in its structure. The straight path nature of locations makes them seem somewhat artificial, and it removes a lot of excitement from repeat playthroughs. This is a bit of a tricky one because the mystery of the puppet frenzy is what drives the journey forward. Breadcrumbs are laid down in a very deliberate and methodical manner to keep the player engaged, and the linearity of the game makes this much simpler for the developers to implement, so I can understand why things are the way they are, but it does come at a bit of a cost. Still, if you can look past that, you'll find a beautifully constructed world positively bursting with detail and environmental storytelling. This is the aftermath of the puppet frenzy. It's post-apocalyptic, and the scale of the damage is striking. Corpses and bloodstains litter the city, not just humans but animals as well. Torn apart carriages lie in a heap on the street, abandoned buildings have been ravaged from the inside, fires continue to rage, the destruction is overwhelming. And yet, evidence of a once flourishing metropolis is everywhere. There is so much to pick up on in the game's signage, the posters, advertisements, and billboards, the documents you can read to learn more about individual characters or certain happenings. Then there's the Grand Exhibition, a great display showcasing the future technology of the puppets, which ironically has been turned inside out. Those same puppets have turned the city itself into an exhibition of a nightmare. The level of detail is quite remarkable at times, so much so that I found myself eager to search everything from head to toe. It does help that the stylistic choice for the game's world is incredibly attractive as well. The sheer opulence on display is spectacular, and it makes for a stunning backdrop and rich contrast against the carnage that dominates the city now. The world of Lies of P is based on the Belle Epoque era, or the Beautiful era, which, to put it simply, was a period of high artistic and cultural development in Europe and particularly France, taking place in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. This can be seen all over the game, in the architecture, the interior design, modes of transport, characters' clothing, their mannerisms, their speech. It is everywhere. A very elegant choice that works well with the concept of automatons, resulting in a steampunk aesthetic at times. This gives the world a very distinct identity, and it also comes across as well realized. A couple locations really stood out to me, the Estella Opera House being the main one. I immediately thought of Canehurst Castle as soon as I opened the doors, but this place is infinitely more colorful. It is a beautiful building with wonderful architecture, very easy on the eyes. Funny, I also thought the Path of the Pilgrim looked eerily similar to the Forbidden Woods, especially this area where the shortcut is placed right next to the Stargazer. And I got major Anor Londo vibes on the bridge heading to the cathedral. With that said, there were 1 or 2 locations that felt somewhat mundane though. The Barren Swamp just didn't appeal to me in any way, and as I mentioned earlier, the final area of the game is outrageously long. I wouldn't say it's bad or anything, but my god does it go on and on. At least the shortcuts are abundant, I guess. That's one thing about Lies of P, it's very generous with shortcuts. Things may be linear, but locations wrap around on themselves nicely, and it always feels good to unlock a faster means of traveling through areas. I was constantly walking up to these doors and zapping myself, even if I knew it wouldn't open from this side. It just became an inevitability. Generally speaking, this is an enjoyable world to travel through. Falling through traps is not as punishing as it possibly could be, because it almost always leads to some sort of treasure chest, and it usually doesn't take long to backtrack to your previous location. A fast travel system is available from the get-go, making it easy to warp between areas, and there are some other quality of life features as well, like short runbacks to the boss room, and the way your death ergo is always placed outside of them, so you can safely retrieve it instead of awkwardly running towards it during the encounter. I also appreciate these little icons that appear in the fast travel menu, giving you a clear indication of what characters to follow up with, and areas you must revisit to complete certain quests. Characters in this game have a lot to say. Hotel Krat acts as the central hub for the adventure, and it slowly becomes more populated as you progress. The primary circle of characters that stick around this location all have individual stories for the player to uncover, and these vary in their quality. Still, they all provide regular commentary on the world around you, including the state of the city, bosses you've just killed, other characters. There's a lot of information to glean here, and it makes repeated trips back to the hotel an engaging prospect. Unsurprisingly, communication plays a vital role in this game. The clue is in the name, Lies of P. Throughout the adventure, you're given many opportunities to either tell the truth or tell a lie, and this influences several things, but most notably, it affects what ending you receive, as well as some other key choices in the game's final act. It's cool to see the developers integrate this system into gameplay, and it goes further. Lies of P is chock full of references to the original Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi, as you'd expect, right? But it's still interesting to pick away at the details. Sophia is clearly meant to represent the blue fairy that gives Pinocchio life. Geppetto, his creator, plays a central role, as he is the father of all puppets in the city. The Red Fox and Black Cat make recurring appearances. It really is fascinating seeing how the developers have twisted the source material here. I cannot be the only one who thinks there is a touch of madness in the idea of a Pinocchio-themed Bloodborne-esque video game. It seems like such a wild concept. Of course, they're taking liberties, but they've made it work, and it's impressive stuff. On the technical side, the game runs smoothly. I played on the PC and experienced a few instances of graphical pop-up and some frame drops here and there, but nothing that took away from the experience in any way. In terms of production values, graphically the game is beautiful and the voice acting is pretty good, but the absolute highlight is the soundtrack, which I honestly think is incredible. It's an extremely varied score with smooth jazz to haunting orchestral pieces, melancholic piano compositions, Far Eastern-inspired works, and an abundance of full songs with vocalists singing in different languages. I'm tempted to say the soundtrack is my favorite thing about Lies of P. It is that good. I apologize in advance for butchering this man's name, but from what I can tell, Yi-kun Yu was the primary composer here, and this guy is one to look out for in the future. The man has a special talent. However, this soundtrack seems to be the work of a collaboration of composers, as many of the tracks, specifically the ones from the records you can find, are all rearrangements of songs from the game series DJ Max, another product of NeoWiz. There's something about rearrangements I find particularly enjoyable, and it's super interesting to compare the vastly more upbeat originals with their somber counterparts in this game. I really cannot stress enough just how good this soundtrack is. This is stunning work and something I was not expecting in the slightest. Lies of P is far from perfect, but I can confidently say it's the best Soulslike I have ever played, hands down. No other game in this genre has even come close to captivating me quite as much as this one. The premise alone is compelling enough, but vitally, there is a polish to Lies of P, with well-designed aspects that will appeal to Souls-like enthusiasts and the less experienced. I agree with the notion that this is the best non-FromSoft Souls game out there, and in fact, I actually think this game is better than Dark Souls 2 and 3. Those are titles I've never been too fond of though, so coming from me, it's really not that big a statement. Still, my point is, this is a brilliant game. I really enjoyed my time with this one, and goddamn the soundtrack is so good, I cannot get enough of it. I'm already looking forward to the DLC, which is slated to release in the second half of 2024, so perhaps a follow-up video will come when that happens. Otherwise, this is an easy recommendation from me. The game is great. Thank you for watching. Please let me know what you think. If you like content like this that goes into detail on games, then you should hit the subscribe button. Thanks again.